Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Kirk. I'm here with Tristan Hansen, and today we're going to be talking to you a little bit about how we're helping our teams accelerate their development through what we call organizational opinions. Now, at the basic level, there's really just two ways you can help your teams get functionality to market more quickly. The first, you can just have them write code faster. I think your results may vary. We've actually opted for the second choice. We're trying to help them write less code, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. How do we help our teams write less code with these organizational opinions? So what are these opinions that we're talking about? Well, let's just start with Spring Boot. Spring Boot's an opinionated framework, right? And that just means it has its ability to look at its environment, the configuration, the libraries that you provide, and it can start to make assumptions and form opinions around what you're trying to do and how it should go about doing it. Right? And this is all delivered as just default behavior when you start the application up. Right? So for example, if you include an H2 database library, JPA libraries, on startup, it's going to establish an in-memory database instance for you, data source bean, entity manager, etc. Everything that you need to have to manage JPA entities in that database instance. And it does just all of this by default. Right? And so it's leveraging the normal Spring configuration mechanism that we're all used to. Spring Boot adds a little layer of automation on top of that to identify which configurations to load at startup. We kind of call this Spring Boot auto configuration, right? So that's Spring Boot's technical opinions. What we're talking about today is how do we take the organizational standards and best practices that we would have within our organizations, and how do we build the same opinions into application libraries that we can provide to our teams in hopes of really helping them write less code and deliver more quickly. And these standards and best practices, doesn't matter whether it's security or operations related, really there's a wide variety of best practices that you can actually take and codify into these application frameworks to help speed their development and speed delivery to market. And really, the goal of this is all to just keep them focused on one thing, and that's delivering business functionality, right? Nobody gets value out of writing more logging code and things of that nature. We want to deliver features to market more quickly. Everybody's happier this way. The business gets their features to market more quickly, right? So they get their customers are happier. The developers are happier because they're not bogged down writing boilerplate code or reviewing documentation to make sure they're in alignment with the latest standards in the enterprise, because it's baked in, right? They're getting it by default, right? They get a lot of great things. As architects, we get some benefits too, right? So we get to enjoy things like predictability, right? Just out of the box, we've provided some good standard functionality that if the developer does nothing, we should feel pretty good about what's being delivered into production, right? So we get that behavior by default. We get consistency. Hopefully we've hit the 80%, right? And we're making it easy for them to do the right thing. So over time, we should get more of a consistent implementation, hopefully doing the right things. And even when it's the 20%, right, the exceptions to the standards, we can actually start to put some boundaries on that to keep them, inside some guardrails to help keep the overall implementation more consistent. The third piece is supportability. Right? So we don't have to just look at the functional capabilities that we're baking into these auto configuration libraries. We should look at the operational aspects too. What can we do to help our operations teams, whether it's the same team as the development or whether it's a separate dedicated team, what can we do to make their lives easier? And once again, deliver that in a way that requires as little effort on the developer's part as possible. And all three of these, they all lead up to the fourth one, and it's the most important one. The fourth is sleep. We get to enjoy more sleep. Everybody enjoy more sleep? Who doesn't like sleep, right? So you may ask, how do I get on this path to more sleep? Well, it all starts with developer experience. We always start the conversation with what's the experience going to be like for the developer. It doesn't matter what your intentions are, it doesn't matter how fantastic of standards you have, if you don't make it dead simple and painless for the development staff to use it, you're going to get friction, you're not going to get the uptake you want, and ultimately, you're not going to get the same benefits, you're not going to get as much sleep. And so we always start the conversation with what should the developer experience be? And so that starts with, should they have a choice, right? Maybe in security and operations, Maybe they don't have a choice. But as you go down and look at different areas, you're going to have choices that you're going to give them. And how are you going to expose that to them? Do they annotate methods or classes to basically communicate, please insert this capability here, right? Are they going to do it through some sort of bean construction, right? There's lots of opportunities. Can they customize the behavior, right? Once again, are there configuration properties that they can tweak the behavior? Are there application beans that they can provide that get wired into your capabilities where they can tweak and customize the behavior? Sky's really the limit on what you can do, right? And that's just on the functional side. We've also got the operations side, like I said before, right? So things like, should we bake in an additional health check that we wire into the actuator endpoint, right? Or an information provider? What are we going to do, or what can we do to help out the operations team and make that as seamless of an experience as possible, right? The last piece I'm going to talk about is ownership. So I mentioned there's a wide variety of standards and practices that you may run into that you can start codifying in this way, right? Some of them I would call horizontal. Those are going to be the more enterprise-wide pieces. Logging and tracing are great examples of those, right? You're going to have vertical pieces. So if you're running in a JEE container, you may have specific ways on how you access configuration or certs or key stores or things of that nature that are very vertically oriented, right? And so you have horizontals and verticals, and then you've got the departmental areas, the teams that are trying to use it, right? And they may be able to use them out of the box. If done properly, they can actually take, and where you've set up the guardrails, they may choose to kind of move those guardrails in a little more for their particular team. And if you've done a good job of writing flexible, open application libraries using the auto configuration, they can actually layer their own opinions on top of these enterprise horizontal or vertical opinions. And so it provides a lot of flexibility for the departmental teams to leverage what's there or possibly help give better direction to their development teams. And with that, I've been into kind of the fluffy stuff. I'm going to head over to Tristan to jump into some code.
Sure. Thanks. So you're probably asking yourself, how can I get started? So today we're going to walk through a little example and explore a few options that you can use to kind of start applying opinions to your organization. So the example we're going to run through is we want to take any REST template beans that are annotated with that request logging, and we want to log any requests that go through that bean. We want that functionality to be enabled by default, and we want to give them the ability to disable it if need be through some kind of configuration property. Okay, so let's take a look at what that looks like in some code. So here you can see this is kind of the developer experience we're looking for. We kind of provide the standard configuration class, the standard REST template bean, but we've added this new annotation called request logging. Now this annotation is what you call, I think it's called a meta annotation. And it's one that you can use to wrap other annotations. So in this case, we're actually going to be wrapping Spring's at qualifier. And this gives a little bit of information to Spring to kind of do some selective dependency injection. Okay. So the first option on how we can kind of use this to process these beans is we can look at implementing a bean post-processor. So this is part of Spring Core. And it runs as part of the Spring application context, I guess the initialization lifecycle. So this is after the beans have been instantiated, but before any initialization code has been run. So there's two methods here that you can override. One is the post-process before initialization, and one is the after, so depending on when you want to apply your customizations. And if need be, you can even return a completely different instance if you want. So if you need to make a copy for any reason, something like that, you can actually return a different instance. Now, this would work great if we were trying to apply this functionality to every bean of that type, because there's no real way to kind of inspect for that annotation to kind of do that filtered application of this. So let's take a look at another option that we can use to kind of give us that filtering. So we can then leverage a smart initializing singleton. So you can kind of think of this as a callback. It kind of occurs at the end of the application context startup, and it calls back in to allow you to do any last minute configurations. So here we've exposed this configuration class. We're going to auto wire in a list of REST template beans, and note we're using that request logging annotation on this as well. This instructs Spring that we only want REST template beans that have that annotation injected in here. The other thing to note is we've set our auto-wired annotation to have a required attribute of false. So by default, if Spring can't find a dependency, it throws a missing dependency exception and kind of stops in its tracks. This instructs Spring that if the implementing application doesn't have a REST template bean, that's okay, that we'll take care of it and it can continue on. So the smart initializing singleton here, you can see we kind of implemented as a Lambda, which is kind of that callback or that functional interface. And here we're actually going to loop through each one of those REST templates and just apply any customization that we need to here. So for this simple example, this would probably be a request interceptor that just logs the request as it goes through. Okay, and that's it. It's like, that's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But we still didn't provide a way for developers to actually turn this on or off. So let's look at a few other examples kind of around this, and then we can give them the ability to kind of use this functionality that we've exposed. So just as a quick reminder, we want it enabled by default and disabled using a property. Okay, so a few options we can use is an add enable annotation. You're probably familiar with these with Spring Security or Spring Data, where they have the enable JPA repositories or enable web security. And this, again, is just another meta annotation that wraps an at import. You might have seen these before. This actually instructs Spring to just include this bean or configuration as part of the application context. Now, this doesn't quite work for our use case, because this would require the developer to kind of remember to add this to their application. So this would work great if you wanted to expose some kind of functionality that the developer could opt into, but it doesn't quite work if we want it on by default. So let's take a look at another. Next option is using a spring.factories file. Now, this is a special properties file that Spring Boot actually scans for on startup. And it looks for these special keys in there. So in this case, we're using the enable auto configuration key. This tells Spring, kind of just like that at import annotation, that if you find this spring.factories file on the class path, include this config along with it. And it's like, and so that's great. So now our config is on by default, but we can do one little tweak to this to kind of give that ability to be able to turn that off, because we can't really do that quite yet. So one minor tweak to this is we're going to add a conditional annotation. So as you can see on our auto configuration, we've applied a conditional on property. So this tells Spring that when you are deciding whether or not to execute this configuration, please go out and inspect the Spring environment to see if this property is set. And in this case, we set the request logging enabled, must have a value of true. So if any reason it's set to false, it'll just skip this and your functionality just won't be applied. Okay. Now, since we're all good developers here, we should write some tests. Spring provides a pretty good mechanism of testing our auto configs, and it's called the application context runner. This allows you to set up this kind of environment, so you can provide it your custom auto configurations, and you can set up your environment however you need to. So in this case, we're setting that request logging enabled property. And then it actually executes kind of a mock application context. And you can run your test assertions against that to make sure that the bean is either not there when it's not supposed to be, it's there when it is supposed to be. Okay? And that's it. We're finally done. That's a pretty simple example. Just a recap. We've kind of created our auto configuration. We've injected in our REST template beans with request logging. Process those using the smart initializing singleton callback, and we've included that in our spring.factories file to enable it by default. And then we have also added that conditional on property to give the developers the ability to opt out. Okay. Now, there's still a couple other things that we can do to kind of enhance our developer experience a little bit further. So Chris mentioned earlier about using a configuration properties beans. For those who don't know, these are basically POJOs that are annotated with configuration property, and it instructs Spring to kind of apply those properties to a POJO in your library, so you can kind of do type safe instead of using an at value annotation. So if you're exposing configurations in that manner to your end user, the developers need a way to kind of discover what those keys are, or what valid values might be, or what even that would be used for. And so this library runs as part of the compilation process of your library. It scans for those beans, and generates a little JSON file that it includes with your library that gives the IDE some hints and kind of descriptions. You've probably seen that if you used STS or IntelliJ, where it provides those little autocompletes for you in the application properties or application YAML. The other would be using an auto configuration processor library. Now, this works the same way as that configuration processor, but in this case, it inspects for those conditional annotations. So Spring uses a lot of class path scanning and reflection to try to determine whether or not it should enable certain configs. And this kind of gives Spring a head start. As part of your compilation, it'll inspect all those conditionals and kind of generate a little index file that Spring can use to kind of short circuit some of that class path scanning and kind of speed up your startup times. Now, this was obviously an overly simplistic example of what you can do, but Spring provides many other mechanisms that you can hook into. Here's just a few examples of, and you can hook in the environment post-processor. So say your organization provides configuration in some custom location or using a custom file. You can actually implement this to transparently apply those configurations to the Spring environment. You can register application listeners. So Spring has a robust kind of event bus internally that it publishes a lot of application context events, but you can also publish and create your own custom events to that and react to any behavior, anything you want to do from there. There's a configuration property binding post-processor. Now, this allows you to manipulate how Spring is mapping those properties in the environment to those POJOs, and we found that this is quite useful if you're renaming properties. So you've deprecated a property, so you might be exposing that as a deprecated property in your application YAML or properties, but you don't have to carry that all the way through into your library. You can actually add some logic, so an adapter basically, to kind of move that value around. And finally, there's lots of other Spring libraries out there that provide some kind of mechanism to configure them. And this is just one example of Spring Security provides the security configure interface. You can implement this to do any configuration changes to the security itself. And this can be, I guess, provided to the developer either through that web security DSL, or it can even be applied to the spring.factories file to be included by default. And I guess last of all, there's many other out-of-the-box ways to determine whether or not you should be enabling this functionality. Here's just a handful of the out-of-the-box on a bean, whether it exists or it doesn't in the application context, whether there's a file on the file system or class path, whether there's just a class on the class path, whether you're running in Cloud Foundry or Kubernetes or Heroku or something like that, or even if you're a batch application or not. So, and if any of these don't meet your needs, that @conditional actually takes in a condition interface that you can implement with any custom logic that you need to. All right. Well, that's really all we have. We have here, if you want to reach out to us on LinkedIn, please feel free. Otherwise, we can take any questions that you guys have. So, yep.
This setting up the bean in Scrum, you guys implemented as like one giant starter, boot starter, or was the boot started with some video functionality? So what is the mechanism to
Sure. So the question is, what is the mechanism to kind of apply these configurations to the application? Yeah. So they're packaged just like you'd be used to on like the Spring Boot starters. I think our journey, we kind of started off with one large one, and then found over time we had to kind of break it down into smaller pieces. But yeah, it was originally just drop in this MasterCard specific starter, and it configures our applications the way that meet our standards. So, yep, back.
Do you have some examples of like some good standards that you might recommend to other organizations that you adopted?
So the question was, are there standards that we have that that we'd recommend to others that we've adopted? I mean, we've been trying to follow industry standards and best practices ourselves. I mean, I think most of them from a security perspective, operations, they're all pretty consistent. It's a matter of we've tried to leverage these to apply those tools or capabilities that we've chosen within the organization so that they're applied in a consistent manner, right, and hopefully make it out of the box. But I think it's the same thing that you're seeing elsewhere, circuit breaker, that type of things for operational aspects, and then Spring Security and the various authentication authorization mechanisms that work for your organization. It's about taking those tools once you've identified them and finding a way to kind of distill it down to here's our standard, here's our best practice, and how can we make it as simple as possible for the developers.
Does this work with web client? Same way?
So the question was, does this work with web client? Yeah, this was just a simple example. So it was more around the patterns of how you can manipulate those. But yeah, it's web client is just a bean like anything else, and so you should be able to any bean and. Yep.
Obviously, there's a lot of teams using the starter thing. How do you handle sort of upgrade paths and fixing bugs and getting teams to get to the latest versions? Which teams are using which versions? You've got sort of processes or mechanisms in place for that?
So the question is, how do we make sure that everyone stays up to date? And I'd like to say that that's a challenge.
So we have built pieces into our build pipeline that we can set essentially kind of minimum standards. And as part of our build process, it will go out and check the libraries that are included in applications and apply some minimum expectations. And as long as you're above that threshold, there's a threshold for warnings and a threshold for, kind of that you don't get to pass. So that's the best way that we try and urge them to move. And then when necessary, force them to move. But hopefully that it doesn't come to that. Yeah?
So in terms of these practices, for a larger organization, it may be possible to have an entire team dedicated to tool maintenance and developer experience, but how would you recommend smaller organizations go about maintaining things in a similar manner?
So the question was, how do small teams go about managing this when they don't have enough, not a large enough organization to have a dedicated team? Well, I can tell you that Tristan and I have kind of tried to drive the ground roots delivery of this and are advocating for this type of approach across the organization. This is not actually our day job, but we're trying to tackle that beachhead, so to speak, and bring the rest of the organization along with us. So you can certainly take a crowdsourcing or grassroots type of effort to get it started.
I think just to add to that, one thing we have found is that we kind of apply the configuration to a single service and kind of find that best practice, and then it just kind of gets promoted up to this level to be kind of shared out in this auto-config style implementation.
We've definitely taken a use case-based approach where we look at the areas that developers are having problems, look at the use case, look at how best to solve that, and then look at how best to deliver that experience, and then we start building it. Right? So it's certainly based on resolving existing pain rather than challenges that we think we're going to face in the future.
Do we have another?
So what we have used, since that was one of the questions, how do you get the whole group to use similar kinds of starters or whatever, is if you're using, say, Maven, then we use a parent project that has all these, like the Spring Boot versions that you're using, the starter that you want to put in them, so that then if you have your own starter, then you apply the parent, all of the projects have to use that as the parent form, and then that works pretty well as well.
Yeah, I think one thing is how we manage our dependencies, I guess, is kind of the gist of that. And we've taken a similar approach because if you actually go and look at Spring Boot itself, when you actually apply that kind of the base Spring Boot starter, it kind of, the dependency management plugin or something like that comes with Spring Boot. And it comes with a similar thing where you kind of use a bill of materials or that BOM or whatever to kind of drive those versions. And we've gone down that path before, and I think we'll probably eventually kind of possibly circle back to that. But yeah, that's definitely a way to do it.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you, everyone.
All right.